Chapter 5. Triangular Diplomacy and the Korean War. In his first major act of foreign policy, Mao Zedong traveled to Moscow on December 16, 1949, barely 2 months after having proclaimed the People's Republic of China. It was his first trip outside China. His purpose was to form an alliance with the communist superpower, the Soviet Union. Instead, the meeting inaugurated a series of moves that would culminate in transforming the hoped-for alliance into a triangular diplomacy by which the United States, China, and the Soviet Union maneuvered with and against each other. In his first meeting with Stalin, which took place on the day of his arrival, Mao stressed China's need for a period of 3 to 5 years of peace, which would be used to bring the economy back to pre-war levels and to stabilize the country in general. Yet within less than a year of Mao's trip, the United States and China would be at war with each other. It all came about through the machinations of a seemingly minor player. Kim Il-sung, the ambitious Soviet-installed ruler of North Korea, a state that had been created only 2 years earlier by agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union based on the zones of liberated Korea each had occupied at the end of the war against Japan. As it happened, Stalin had little interest in helping China recover. He had not forgotten the defection of Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia and the only European communist leader to have achieved power by his own efforts and not as the result of Soviet occupation. Tito had broken with the Soviet Union during the preceding year. Stalin was determined to avoid a similar outcome in Asia. He understood the geopolitical significance of the communist victory in China. His strategic goal was to manipulate its consequences and benefit from its impact. Stalin could have little doubt that, in Mao, he was dealing with a formidable figure. The Chinese communists had prevailed in the Chinese Civil War against Soviet expectations and by ignoring Soviet advice. Though Mao had announced China's intent to lean to one side, Moscow's, in international affairs, of all communist leaders he was among the least beholden to Moscow for his position, and he now governed the most populous communist country. Thus the encounter between the two communist giants led to an intricate minuet culminating, 6 months later, with the Korean War, which involved China, and the United States directly and the Soviet Union by proxy. Convinced that the raging American debate over who lost China augured an eventual American attempt to reverse the outcome, a view to which communist ideology led him, in any event, Mao strove for the greatest possible material and military support from the Soviet Union. A formal alliance was his objective. But the two communist autocrats were not destined to cooperate easily. Stalin had, by that time, been in power for nearly 30 years. He had triumphed over all domestic opposition and led his country to victory against the Nazi invaders at horrific cost in human life. The organizer of periodic purges involving millions of victims and, even then, in the process of starting a new set of purges, Stalin was by now beyond ideology. His leadership was instead marked by a ruthless, cynical Machiavellianism based on his brutal interpretation of Russian national history. During China's long struggles with Japan in the 1930s and 1940s, Stalin had deprecated the potential of the communist forces and disparaged Mao's rural, peasant-based strategy. Throughout, Moscow had maintained official ties with the nationalist government. At the end of the war against Japan in 1945, Stalin had obliged Chiang Kai-shek to grant the Soviet Union privileges in Manchuria and Xinjiang comparable to those achieved by the Tsarist regime, and to recognize Outer Mongolia as a nominally independent People's Republic under Soviet control. Stalin actively encouraged separatist forces in Xinjiang. At Yalta that same year, Stalin insisted to his colleagues, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, on international recognition for Soviet special rights in Manchuria, including a naval base at Lushan, the old Port Arthur, and a harbor in Dalian, as a condition for entering the war against Japan. In August 1945, Moscow and the nationalist authorities signed a treaty affirming the Yalta Agreements. In these circumstances, the meeting of the two communist titans in Moscow could not possibly be the warm embrace shared ideology called for. As Nikita Khrushchev, then a member of Stalin's Politburo, recalled, Stalin loved to show off his hospitality to his esteemed guests, and he knew how to do it very well. But during Mao's stay, Stalin would sometimes not lay eyes on him for days at a time, and since Stalin neither saw Mao nor ordered anyone else to entertain him, no one dared go see him. Mao let it be known that if the situation continued, he would leave. When Stalin heard about Mao's complaints, I think he had another dinner for him. It was clear from the outset that Stalin did not consider the communist victory a reason for giving up the gains he had made for the Soviet Union as a price for entering the war against Japan. Mao began the conversation by stressing his need for peace, telling Stalin, decisions on the most important questions in China hinge on the prospects for a peaceful future. With this in mind, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China entrusted me to ascertain from you, Comrade Stalin, in what way and for how long will international peace be preserved. Stalin was reassuring about prospects for peace, perhaps to slow down any requests for emergency assistance, and to minimize the urgency of rushing into an alliance. The question of peace greatly occupies the Soviet Union as well, though we have already had peace for the past 4 years. With regards to China, there is no immediate threat at the present time. Japan has yet to stand up on its feet, and is thus not ready for war. America, though it screams war, is actually afraid of war more than anything. Europe is afraid of war. In essence, there is no one to fight with China, not unless Kim Il-sung decides to invade China. Peace will depend on our efforts. If we continue to be friendly, peace can last not only 5 to 10 years, but 20, 25 years and perhaps even longer. If that was the case, a military alliance was really not needed. Stalin made his reserve explicit when Mao formally raised the issue. He made the stunning assertion that a new treaty of alliance was superfluous. The existing treaty, which had been signed with Chiang Kai-shek in quite different circumstances, would suffice. Stalin buttressed this argument with the claim that the Soviet position was designed to avoid giving America and England the legal grounds to raise questions about modifying the Yalta Agreements. In effect, Stalin was arguing that communism in China was best protected by a Russian agreement made with the government Mao had just overthrown. Stalin liked this argument so much that he also applied it to the concessions the Soviet Union had extracted from Chiang Kai-shek with respect to Xinjiang and Manchuria, which, in his view, should now be continued at Mao's request. Mao, ever the fervent nationalist, rejected these ideas by redefining Stalin's request. The present arrangements along the Manchurian Railroad, he argued, corresponded to Chinese interests insofar as they provided a training school for the preparation of Chinese cadres in railroad and industry. Chinese personnel needed to take over as soon as they could be trained. Soviet advisors could stay until this training was completed. Amidst protestations of amity and affirmations of ideological solidarity, two major Machiavellians were maneuvering over ultimate predominance, and over sizable tracts of territory around China's periphery. Stalin was the senior and, for a time, more powerful, Mao, in a geopolitical sense, the more self-confident. Both were superior strategists and therefore understood that, on the course they were formally charting, their interests were almost bound to clash eventually. After a month of haggling, Stalin yielded and agreed to a treaty of alliance. However, he insisted Dalian and Lushan would remain Soviet bases until a peace treaty with Japan was signed. Moscow and Beijing finally concluded a treaty of friendship, alliance and mutual assistance on February 14, 1950. It provided what Mao had sought and Stalin had tried to avoid, an obligation of mutual assistance in case of conflict with a third power. Theoretically, it obliged China to come to the assistance of the Soviet Union globally. Operationally, it gave Mao a safety net if the various looming crises around China's borders were to escalate. The price China had to pay was steep: mining, railroad, and other concessions in Manchuria and Xinjiang. The recognition of the independence of Outer Mongolia. Soviet use of Dalian Harbor. And the use, until 1952, of the Lushan naval base. Years later, Mao would still complain bitterly to Khrushchev about Stalin's attempt to establish semi-colonies in China by means of these concessions. As for Stalin, the emergence of a potentially powerful eastern neighbor presented a geopolitical nightmare. No Russian ruler could ignore the extraordinary demographic disparity between China and Russia along a 2,000-mile frontier. A Chinese population of over 500 million adjoined a Russian total of less than 40 million in Siberia. At what point in China's development would numbers begin to matter? Seeming consensus on ideology emphasized, rather than diminished, the concern. Stalin was too cynical to doubt that when powerful men achieve eminence by what they consider their own efforts, they resist the claim of superior orthodoxy by an ally, however close. Stalin, having taken the measure of Mao, must have known that he would never concede to doctrinal preeminence.